Guys, so Dawie Roodt is slamming us once more with the numbers. And these numbers actually concern the hit, the impact that the tariffs South Africa is expecting by the 1st of August from the United States, from the Trump regime, would be hitting, how much impact South Africa will get from those tariffs. We know that SA should be expecting 30% tariff hit from the 1st of August. And I would argue another 10% for what Trump argued, its alignment with BRICS anti-American policies. So probably if everything comes into effect, we'll be expecting a 40% tariff hit on the South African economy that is not growing as much as probably 3%. If you listen to Dawie Roodt, especially in this video, he argues that the economy of South Africa is growing to 0.6, 0.7, 0.8% per annum. And to add any kind of tariff on that would actually spiral negatively fast. All right, tariffs have actually been historically used to, not in the sense of punish per se, but kind of like slow down certain economies and all of that. And, you know, to compare the tariffs that would hit an economy that's growing at a rate of 5% per annum compared to one growing at a rate of 0.7% per annum, I think you can already make your conclusions. But one thing that really hits me, especially from this reality, is that South Africa, according to Dawie Roodt's numbers now, South Africa has to the tune of 10 million people who are unemployed. And he argues that the companies that these tariffs would hit coming from the US on the 1st of August would be the automobile company and some parts of the agricultural economy, right? So in the numbers, he says, according to the Treasury, these tariffs would likely hit approximately and allegedly to the tune of 100,000 jobs. So we might be expecting 100,000 jobs lost. And that's one of the things that he complains strikes him the more. He thinks that, you know, if you argue that 100,000 jobs in with a population of 60 million people wouldn't be so much, it becomes another question when you consider 100,000 jobs in an economy where there are already 10 million people unemployed. It's crazy. All right, so we'll be picking up another 100,000 people, adding into this critical mass of unemployed people in a country that still suffers from a lot of crime, that still suffers from a lot of, femicides, gang-related violence and all of that. So I think this is where, if you listen carefully to the likes of economists like Dawie Roodt and the other guy I shared on my channel, I don't remember his name now, this is where the essence of the hit actually would be hitting. And many people have been calling, especially now we know that the DA has actually had Emma Powell, who was international relations spokesperson, resign because of the fact that the DA has been pushing to understand what the ANC has in plan to negotiate, because the EU has actually concluded, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, the EU was successful at negotiating with Donald Trump a 15%, so to speak, tariffs, especially for automobile. Dawie Roodt argues here, and I will be playing this part of the video anyway. I got it from the channel, the security channel. It's getting slowly popular though. But he argues that, in terms of automobiles, right, South Africa, I think, exports Mercedes, right? And the EU now has been able to also negotiate for a 15% tariff for their cars into the US. In other words, South African automobiles, especially the likes of the Mercedes and most of the automobiles it exports into the US market, all right, still maintain or have a 25% levy on them, while the EU has been able to negotiate a 15% levy on the same. So in other words, the US will easily be able to get these cars from the EU, while South Africa still struggles. And he also complains about the fact that South Africa also is unable to compete internationally. And then you add the 25% levy, to which the EU now has a comparative advantage over it. It's like a disaster in terms of trying to really understand if probably export to the other African markets would save South Africa. Dawie Roodt argues that Africans, that many African countries themselves are really poor. There's the AFTCA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that is actually being tried to be run now to expand the African market, but it's really taking off really slowly and in a very problematic way. There's a lack of political will by many governments to really allow their borders to be open and enforce a wide market, all right? And so he argues that the export of this South African automobile to other African countries, and it's really funny how he refers to how if South Africa can export to Africa, it makes me laugh as though South Africa is not a part of Africa. But anyway, I think that what he means is that in exporting to other African countries do not buy much of the Mercedes. So in other words, and this is what I've been saying, South Africa has actually been an economy that has built a trajectory of infrastructure, economic relations and all that with the market in the US. The market in the US is if you listen to the likes of President of Uganda, especially in a speech he made yesterday in Kenya, while on a working visit, he argues that the market in the US alone, like if you take one city, one state in Minnesota, for example, or in Texas, for example, a business person can actually sell in just that city or that state and be wealthy. I mean, like the market in itself is ready to consume, whatever produce. So in other words, South Africa has enjoyed this market tariff-free under the AGOA agreement for many years, all right? Now with Trump coming in and South Africa on the brink of losing that AGOA relationship and also many of the benefits it had with the USAID, this 30-40% tariff that will be hitting South Africa, would actually demand, so to speak, a quick response in terms of negotiations and all that by a US envoy, for example. But I found a video with Mcebisi Jonas, who is actually the US envoy picked by President Ramaphosa to represent South Africa in the US. He had this to say regarding the recent altercations regarding his positionality, his post as special envoy to the US. Let's quickly listen to him describe and in his interpretation of what is really going on.
So you spoke about the issue of national interest, but also the foreign policy that it should not be captured by business cabal and so forth. I would imagine that's also another very critical area to look at.
I think it's very clear that, the state must be at the center of driving foreign policy, but it must also build consensus around what constitutes national interest. National interest should be about the development of the state. It should be about the economy, developing our economy, building an inclusive economy. It should also be about values. And all of these things are enshrined in our constitution, in the Freedom Charter and many other documents. So we must start a process of really consolidating and building consensus on what constitutes national interest. As we engage with a new global reality, we engage it armed with a clear assessment and a clear knowledge of what South Africa's national interest is.
So you also spoke about the US as a very central player. 600 American companies in South Africa. But I suppose, just in the interest of our audience, are you still engaging with your counterparts in the US?
Look, my role really is a presidential special envoy. My role is really to advise on policy, and I do engagements for sure. But I think my main focus is building South Africa's response to this reality, to the new reality, and engaging with all the agencies of the state, but also engaging with all stakeholders in the private sector, in civil society and everywhere, so that South Africans speak with one voice on these issues, and also educating ourselves about what should our responses be.
And are you going to DC anytime soon?
Well, it's not on my agenda unless the president deemed it necessary. I'm not a diplomat, by the way. I probably will.
And how has it been, this new role? You wear so many hats, Mr. Jonas.
Look, it's like everything. Everything in South Africa tend to be plunged into how fractious and intoxicated the environment has been. We must understand that some people be way beyond when we're thinking about these things, when they were already on the ground in the US and campaigning and decampaigning South Africa, etc. I think that's something that I think we must fight against and bring a logic and a sensible voice about who we are and what we stand for.
Yeah, so you've heard it for yourself, guys. So he believes that he has no business in Washington at the moment, except President Ramaphosa enforces that, and his role is actually to advise. All right, and so at the end of the day, the DA actually thinking that South Africa has to be at the place where it's negotiating now to help either ratify these tariffs, reduce them, or find a better deal. There's really no representation. And probably this was why Emma Powell was going paranoid and all of that. But now at the end of the day, we're clear that it seems that these tariffs are going to land on South Africa, I don't want to use the word hitch-free, but I mean, like, it's just going to really hit South Africa. And I think that's quite unfortunate, especially for an economy that isn't growing. That is, its growth, according to Dawie Roodt, it's at around 0.7 to 0.8% thereabouts. So that's shocking. But let's quickly listen to Dawie Roodt break these numbers down for us. I really enjoy him so much because I love the way he works closely with his numbers. And share your thoughts in the comments.
What I've heard is that the Americans said no. The Liberation Day is the 1st of August, and the tariffs, whatever it's going to be, will be implemented. So it doesn't seem to me as if the South African government understands the urgency of this, because this is really urgent. I think it's going to be really bad for the South African economy. And it seems to me as if they are just not there. They not to be found anywhere. So I don't know what's going on. Maybe there's something happening behind the scenes that I'm not aware of. So
well, if there are, it needs to happen pretty quick.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the real issue here is that it's not really going to impact, if the 30% is actually applied, it's not going to impact that much on the South African economy. It's probably going to shave off point something of economic growth. But the context is that we've got an economy that's hardly growing, and everything just keeps on adding up. And I'm not so sure this is the last scene of Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump, and he's got a lot of more, he's got many much bigger sticks in the White House that they can use against South Africa. So if he doesn't like South Africa's international diplomatic positions, for example, or if he doesn't like some other things, domestic things that's happening in South Africa, there's a lot more that he can do. But it seems to me at this stage, well, since the AGOA is gone, I can't see how AGOA can survive this, but it seems to me at this stage, if the 30% is probably going to be applied.
Well, even if it won't affect the GDP that much, some sectors are exposed. Who are they?
Yeah. Some sectors of the South African is more exposed than others. Typically, for example, the motor industry and certain parts of the agricultural industry. But you're right, we're not talking about much impact on the South African economy. About 0.1, 0.2% on an economy that's only expanding at a rate of 0.7 or 0.8% is a big deal, actually. If we talk about an economy that's growing at 4 or 5%, 0.1 or 0.2 doesn't make that much difference to economic growth. But the South African economy has been really underperforming for a very, very long time. And the reason why the economy has been underperforming has to do with a government that is just implementing the wrong policies, a government that's quite often incompetent, and a government that's quite often corrupt. So, and we can see this now. I mean, I call this incompetence if there's not really happening behind anything much happening behind the scenes. So this is another example of how the ANC is actually undermining the South African economy, because they've dragged their feet. They are not coming with some sort of deal with Donald Trump. Now, we can argue about the Americans or Donald Trump being unfair. We can argue and we can call him a bully. You can call him whatever you want to, but the reality is that he's the biggest bully on the playground. And you better go and talk to this guy, because he can really hurt us. And I think this is going to hurt the South African economy as well.
So what impact would it now have that the EU managed to get a deal of 15% tariffs, which means, what does it mean for Americans who buy South African cars? If they can get it from the EU at 15%, which is a Mercedes or, anything European, what impact would it have on the automotive industry?
Well, our levies on the motor car industry at the moment is 25%, so it's going to be more. It's going to be more severe, the levies on the South African economy. But remember also is that the South African motor industry has been getting this huge indirect subsidy for many, many years. And despite this huge subsidy for many years, they still cannot compete internationally. And now we have to compete against the Europeans as an example, and they are levied to 15% levy, while we will be getting a 25% levy. It just goes to show what the impact on the South African economy, broadly speaking, is because of things like, for example, a lack of electricity and many other issues that we have in South Africa. So we've got a subsidy, and now we will have an additional levy compared to the Europeans, and still we won't be able to compete internationally. So now I'm afraid the motor car industry, and we can already see that the exports to the United States from the motor car industry is being affected quite severely. So that's an industry that's certainly going to battle over the next couple of years.
And what about job losses? Is it possible to estimate how many jobs will be lost because of this?
Well, according to the Reserve Bank, we're talking about 100,000 jobs that will be lost. But again, the context here that's really that matters. We've got unemployment levels in South Africa, depending on what definition you use, but we've got probably around about 10 million people in South Africa without jobs. Those are the official numbers. So add another 100,000 to that. 100,000 in itself is not that many jobs, but 100,000 on top of 10 million unemployed people already. We're talking about some serious numbers here. So we're talking about huge increase on top of the high levels of unemployment in South Africa already. But also important is that certain regions will be affected. For example, East London will be affected. The region in the Eastern Cape, for example, will be affected quite much more than many other places. And also Pretoria, by the way, where I stay. There are also major motor car manufacturers in Pretoria, and that will be affected as well. So yeah, certain areas, certain industries will be more affected than others.
Well, could a pivot to the EU or Asia or even Africa, could that help to ease this pressure that's going to come from the US?
No, well, we can try to export to Africa, but Africa is a poor continent. Africa does not buy Mercedeses. We can try, and there certainly is a market, but Africa's got some other challenges. We've got the Africa Free Trade Agreement that is just not used properly. That is actually an opportunity, but not much is really happening on that front. If you want to export to the East, I'm afraid that's not going to happen because the Chinese, they've captured that market completely and totally. In fact, the Chinese are making life very difficult for the local motor car industry as well. So no, Africa perhaps, maybe some European countries that we can export to, but this is a major loss. We export certain models to the United States, and to get somebody else to take, that's not going to be easy.